Well, you watched a lot of important videos, and everybody really appreciates it. You have a beautiful job. So thank you. During your deliberations, I just want you to remember what is relevant in why you're here. You're here to do one job. You judge the actions of one officer, Sergeant Higdon. The taser is not an issue yet. It's not Officer PreJ is not on that report. In fact, the taser did go through its own, the use of force did go through its own investigation. She testified that there is a process with every use of force, and it was found to have met the standard. You have 5 charges in front of you. You have the policies that were violated. Your only job is to determine whether Sergeant Higdon violated those policies, and if he did, what discipline is appropriate. Sheriff Maples has recommended termination. He did not make this recommendation lightly. He certainly didn't make it because Mr. Higdon, or Sergeant Higdon, was a political, the sweatshirt, this hard candidate. That's not just, it's nonsense. Sheriff Maples understands how hard this is for you, given Sergeant Higdon's more than 30 years of service. Of course, that's hard. So he wouldn't ask you to do that unless he thought it was necessary. You heard unsupported testimony from various people about other acts of the Clark County Sheriff's Office that were worse than Sergeant Higdon, that weren't disciplined. I'll just ask you to remember that Sheriff Maples has only been sheriff since 2023. So I didn't hear acts that while he was sheriff that he ignored or didn't discipline. You've heard that body cam has really changed the process. I mean, now we can see what's happening. You know, it allows people to come forward with complaints. Sheriff Maples would not ask for termination unless it was important to officer safety and the safety of the public. The body cam of Sergeant Higdon wandering around while 2 other guys were dealing with a known risk to law enforcement is just unacceptable, particularly when the officer takes no accountability. And, you know, thankfully our other 2 officers handled that situation really well. And they didn't get hurt. But it's what you heard from Chief and from Sheriff is that anxiety about what about the next day. That's what they're concerned about. And it's the lack of Sergeant Higdon's accountability of it. I mean, to have somebody come to you with something so serious, whether you agree with it or not, your boss is coming to you with something so serious, and for you just to think that this is more of a political sweatshirt, it just doesn't make any sense. It's almost like you don't trust his critical thinking at this point. Sergeant Higdon continues to think he's done nothing wrong. He's not going to accept remedial training. He testified that training would not do him good for him. Before you write your opinion, read the testimony. That's what he testified to. Now, Mr. Weber would like to diminish the importance of retraining. And the way he presents that is, well, if you're asking, why are you asking for termination now when you were willing to keep it? And he keeps forgetting there were circumstances, right? You have to get rid of your brain because you can't supervise people because we don't trust you. You have to come today so that we can put somebody with you. So we wouldn't keep Sergeant Higdon on the road by himself. That remedial training requires an officer to ride with him. The chief testified about that. That would be an extensive retraining program, a remedial retraining program. And he would have to pass that program. He has to make his administrators feel safe that he's on the road. They are responsible for all of the officers and the community. And Sergeant Maples could force him to go through training. He could. He can't take away his rank, so he could leave him in a sergeant position over young guys with families at home who don't feel safe with him as their backup, and he could have them do training that way while he's a supervisor of dealing with young officers. But what is force training going to do for somebody who literally has testified that he doesn't think he's done anything wrong? Anything wrong. Regardless, Sergeant Higdon himself testified that, like I said, additional training would not do him any good. So that's really why Sheriff is found his voice, but after termination, he has a duty to protect his officers, he has a duty to protect the public. Given the narrow focus of your duties here, you heard a lot of irrelevant information, a lot of noise, a lot of interference in this marijuana process, and it was all at discretion. You heard a lot about whether the taser used on Devin Lyons was an appropriate use of force. First, that incident again is not on trial here, but this is the big selective enforcement argument, right? It's like, why didn't they investigate this use of force? You know, they have put on witnesses that disagree that the taser should have been used. Or some people in the public think that the taser should not have been used. The problem with that argument is nobody ever made a complaint that got to a situation. The taser goes through a review process because every use of force does. That review process showed that it met our policies. Therefore, there was no complaint made. There was no internal investigation. There's nothing to compare that says this person did wrong and we treated him differently than this person because he wore a Sheriff Maples shirt. Is that the argument? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. There is no selective enforcement because there was no enforcement. There was no enforcement to compare. You know, it doesn't matter whether you have testimony that people who aren't in control think that the taser should have been used. There was no enforcement, and so it's not selective enforcement. You don't have two enforcement criteria to compare. You heard a lot of officers, including an expert, testify that use of force was proper. And, you know, even though that argument really should be irrelevant to this board, yeah, a lot of officers, including an expert, testified that it was a proper use of force. Sergeant Higdon testified that he did not think that it was a proper use of force. And that's really interesting because he was on scene and had a duty to intervene if it was not a proper use of force. But he didn't. He didn't intervene, he wasn't there. Or he wasn't at the site of the force. But more importantly, if he really thought that taser was playing with the proper use of force, why didn't he make a complaint? Why did he make a complaint against Officer Fruitday? He's the supervisor. Sergeant Higdon did file a complaint because he knows it was proper use of force. He knows it was. And he knows Officer Fruitday is a great officer. You heard him testify, he's a great officer. Instead of taking responsibility for his own actions, he's made a choice to present a false narrative that doesn't even make sense or have factual or legal support. Sergeant Higdon would have you believe that Sheriff Maples terminating him, a 30-year-plus veteran, because he wore a sweatshirt, one of Sheriff Maples' opponents. This political argument actually supports Sheriff Maples more than it supports Everyone knows that it would be a terrible political move for him to terminate a law enforcement officer during a campaign season. I mean, he'd gotten a lot of public scrutiny. It would have been way easier for him to postpone this termination until after the election. And he could have done that. He absolutely is within his right to do that. He could have done that. And he is a political guy. He knows that this is not politically popular. He's doing what's right. He's doing the right thing. He could not leave Sergeant Higdon in his position over younger officers when he's not acting like a safe officer. He's not responding to the threat. He's not doing for the thing. That's what we thought. So Sergeant Higdon's political motivation and selective enforcement arguments fall flat. There just is no nexus between any political motivation and the discipline of Sergeant Higdon. Sheriff Maples could not make Sergeant Higdon act in the way that he did. I mean, what he go and make him, not follow his guys and detain Devin Lyons. I mean, he can't make this stuff up. These are acts that were committed. He can't, help that nobody told him about it until after 3 other incidents. He can't help that there are three incidents that are getting investigated. So let's focus on why we're really here. Sergeant Higdon has the 5 charges. They culminated through 3 different incidents over a period of about 3 months. Sergeant Higdon testified that he does not dispute 2 of the charges. 4, that he didn't wear a body camera during the Cynthia Guthrie incident, and 5, that he didn't follow procedures for an internal investigation on business card allegation. He doesn't think either of those is a big deal, but there is no dispute that he did not follow the procedures. I do want to take a moment. I do want to take just a quick moment to talk about that business card thing, because, while the Devin Lyon thing is the most important thing, that's why the sheriff got the termination. That officer's rights thing is a big deal. Sergeant Higdon testified that had they taken those cards, it would be a crime. Had they had those cards in their patrol car, it would be a crime. Our officers, we can't compel them to testify about criminal behavior. We have to, by statute, provide them with a statement of the officer's rights. And one the right is that if you testify about criminal conduct during an internal investigation, it can't be used against you in a criminal investigation or a criminal charge later. And that they weren't given those rights. So, he's just kind of lucky that, of course, our guys didn't steal the cards. But what if they had said yes? Then they just, they admitted to a crime and they weren't under officers' rights. But obviously we are here for Devin Lyons. I wanted to say that because, you all do represent all of the officers. And the officers' rights it's important. It's there for a reason. But obviously Devin Lyons' failure to act is the reason Sheriff Maples is seeking termination. You heard every officer, including Sergeant Higdon, testify that Devin is known to resist law enforcement. Nobody disputed that. He is known to resist law enforcement. When Devin is off his meds, it's going to be on. Everybody knows it, including Sergeant Higdon. You have his criminal history in your exhibits. Check it out. It's extensive. He's marked as a safety risk in the dispatch system. He's known to have access to firearms and has walked up and down the street with his AR-15 around schools. He is red flagged, so in theory he shouldn't have any firearms, but he also has some mental health issues. So who knows if he's abiding by his honoring his red flag status. This is the backdrop of what resulted in Sergeant Higdon's failure to act. Remember, Sergeant Higdon was the ranking officer. He could have done whatever he wanted to do on that scene. He did do whatever he wanted to do in that scene, which was nothing. But remember too that those officers didn't just invite themselves over to Devin and talk. They were called there. They were called there because Devin was men and who was prayer. Mr. Weber's distraction about whether officers checked to confirm whether she had guardianship over him, another waste of time. You had so much wasted time that it's maddening. First of all, it doesn't matter whether she had guardianship over him, because if you do an emergency detention, you can without guardianship. Here, everyone knows Devin has a problem. He's walking barefoot on the horns outside. He's officer dad. These officers know this subject. Second, she is his guardian. You can look it up on my case. So all of that line of questioning after officer about this guardianship thing, complete smoke and mirrors, waste of time. It was simply to try to discredit our officers. And I'm sure that it didn't work, but I just want to bring that to your attention. Mr. Weber's attacks on our officers require an erasure of the history to get an isolated incident as though no one knew that. Because law enforcement community has been helping this law enforcement community. I've been helping Devin and his family for a long time, but August 24 was no different. Officer 3J and Corporal McCutcheon, they were there to help Devin, and they did. They did exactly what he needed to do. They did exactly what they needed to do and what Devin needed to. He needed from them. You watch the photos of Sergeant Higdon's body cam and Corporal McCutcheon's body cam. I encourage you to watch them again as you deliberate. Watch them again. You saw that Sergeant Higdon decided to split away from the other 2 officers. Lots of the officers, including 2 that hold the same rank as Sergeant Higdon, decided that would not have separated from their guys, particularly being the subject. And we knew where he was because of the GPS. At least 3 that I remember said that they would have been in body. who have been leading as the leaders. Regardless, the most stunning frame of the body cam is, of course, when Sergeant Higdon hears the taser shot and the screen. He literally does not even move for 20 seconds. Watch the video. He doesn't move. After he messes with his phone. Then, even though he knows exactly where his guys are, and exactly where Devin is, he talks to him, call out for it. He knows where they are. He doesn't rush over there. He doesn't hurry over there, to help. Instead, he meanders around for more than 4 minutes until eventually, thankfully, his guys come out and find him. Every law enforcement officer knows how critical 4 minutes. 4 minutes is a long time. The only help Sergeant Higdon offered them until the very end, when Devin was getting into the ambulance, was to let the other officers know that chickens were following them and to move the thorn bush out of the way. You saw the body camera for yourself. Absolutely no sense of urgency after hearing a taser shot and a terrible scream. You saw the camera and you heard Sergeant Higdon testify that he didn't use his radio for anything during the call. So he hears a taser shot, and when a taser is shot, they have to radio taser deployed. So he didn't hear that radio call. So he has no idea who really fired the taser. Because if the officer fired the taser, he should hear taser deployed. He didn't hear that. But he also didn't do it himself to dispatch. That's why they do that, right? They do taser deploy because dispatch knows there's trouble. We're having trouble. He didn't hear the signal 100. Doesn't matter whether or not Corporal McCutcheon thought of it himself. He accepted it when it was offered to him because when there's a use of force, that's the signal 100 is called so that other officers can get there. And in fact, another officer was on the way. He didn't use his radio to check on his guys. Guys okay? And then he would have known his radio wasn't working. Maybe it would have been working for him. Don't know. He didn't use it to call for backup. He didn't add any assistance. As Mr. Weber said, the only officers who testified haven't worked for the Clark County Sheriff's Office for quite a while. I think most of them are more than 5 years gone. I don't know how he's handling himself now. One of them worked day shift, so I don't know, there's testimony Sergeant Higdon works nights, always. So you've had all of this information to think about. So his charges, you have your charging affidavit, and his charges for the Devin Lyons incident are all CC SO 3. And the 2 charges are accident competence and neglect. All 3 of these charges, through all this testimony, have been shown by substantial, reliable, and probative evidence. Substantial, reliable, and probative evidence. So the next step for you is what this one. Sheriff Maples again recommends termination. As I said before, he did not come to that decision lightly. When you started with OK statements yesterday, Mr. Weber characterized the charges against Sergeant Higdon as not unknown to the Levians. Sergeant Higdon's testimony shows that he minimizes the severity of his actions in the same way. He takes zero accountability. You heard him testify that he does not think he did anything wrong even now. You heard him testify that he does not need any remedial training. You heard a technical expert testify that without remedial training, Sergeant Higdon puts officer safety at risk and society at risk. That expert was so disturbed by Sergeant Higdon's body camera failure to act that this is the first case where he's ever testified against the officers. Why did he do this? They got to do so that they have to be accountable. Most importantly, when you're deciding about termination of some other means of discipline, you have to remember that and listen to the testimony. Sergeant Higdon himself testified that additional training would not do any good. Sergeant Higdon has made it abundantly clear that he's not going to abide by this administration's policies and that retraining may be futile. This merit board is responsible for all of America at the Sheriff's Office. There are multiple deputies testified that do not will state Sergeant Higdon back in enough. Each of his subordinates testified to it. These guys have no feeling at home that they want to get back to. One superior officer testified that he felt it, but only because he can tell Sergeant Higdon what to do. At least once warned his wife that if anything happens to him, to look to see if Sergeant Higdon was involved, so that she could hold the agency responsible. The officers on Sergeant Higdon's shift understand that they cannot count on him. Now we have that out again and it proves it. We know, we are put on notice. Sergeant Higdon is not looking to changing his behavior to comply with this administration's directives. We heard his testimony about Sergeant Higdon being compliant under other administrations, but not now. Not now. Instead of being open to the idea of becoming a veteran police officer and taking some accountability, Sergeant Higdon chose to insert nothing but interference into this process. He improved the Facebook page that was used to crucify this office and challenge the integrity of the office and the process. Why would anyone else ever want to come forward? Why would anyone else ever want to come forward?
We have to object, we don't argue. There's been absolutely no evidence that suggests that.
Sergeant Higdon testified. I asked him if he asked his brother to do it or not to do it. He said he did not ask him not to do it.
That's not the same as.
Okay.
What she's just.
Okay, Mr. Weber.
Was that he did not tell his brother to do it, but that he did not want to know.
So that, I mean, if you don't approve of something, I hope that you can tell your sibling not to take it. I would hope, but, you know, perhaps Sergeant Higdon also. You heard multiple officers testify using a very pro code. It just shows that he does not care about law enforcement policies. And what did we hear time after time? It's just Tom and Tom. Retire on. You heard that so many times that Mr. Weber questioned whether we coached the witnesses to say that. I can assure you that we did not. In fact, we were just as shocked as Mr. Weber to hear that consistent characterization from Sergeant Higdon. I was shocked. You cannot risk Sergeant Higdon's lackadaisical approach to his job. It's too important. Too many lives depend on law enforcement officers' commitment to run toward the sound of danger. Because Sergeant Higdon has detached from his job and has no interest in being retained, Sheriff Maples respectfully asks that you accept his recommendation and terminate Sergeant Higdon. He has no choice and neither do you. Now that we are on notice that Sergeant Higdon cannot or will not run toward the sound of danger, we cannot continue to allow him to be a law enforcement officer. If his officer does this, over.
Thank you, Ms. Bonner.